From MCA Chicago, the Larry and Marilyn Fields curator Carla Acevedo Yates will be following. And tonight is also in partnership with our local communities, specifically USD. A lot of times the museum works with fellow schools and cultural institutions to really raise up the San Diego art scene. So this evening, I'm going to invite Farrah Karapetian, our USD colleague, to speak a little bit more about her relationship with Chris and also our partnership as well. And before we get into it, if everyone can take a moment to silence their phones, I would really appreciate it. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isabel. You need your phone. It has this amazing holder. Can I borrow your holder? Thank you for having me. All right, I wrote this introduction after a few days of conversation with Chris, and so it may be a little fresh. But if anyone has ever had the good fortune to ask Christopher Cozier a question, you know that you will soon encounter an archive of irreplaceable associations. Which Eastern European critic visited which exhibition in London in the mid-1980s? What online resource now archives the reviews of the shows? Which artists from which region of the Caribbean were on whose side on any one debate? This kind of rabbit hole recovers, if you really listen, ideas and their embodiment that are far more valuable than can possibly be represented by the waves of market interest that ebb and flow in the global art world. It's a rare, generous experience in an atmosphere the entropic nature of which is to distill, abbreviate, and brand instead of opening up these obscured histories and fostering understanding. So I know I'm one of many people who've come through Trinidad in Christopher's lifetime and asked him a question. He may give you an hour or half a day. I'm guilty of having borrowed quite a bit more of his time than that on my several trips, and I'm thrilled to have been able to offer, to foster this exchange with him today, bringing him here to California so that you too can learn with him through his work. I've invited him in my capacity at the Humanities Center at the University of San Diego, where I teach in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History. As Isabel has said, we're hosting him in collaboration with the wonderful people here at MCASD on the occasion of this thoughtfully curated show, Forecast Form. So thank you to everyone involved for the opportunity. A little bio, Christopher was born in Trinidad a few years before Trinidad achieved independence from Great Britain. Artists like Carlisle Chang and Sybil Atek designed the symbols of the new nation state. You can actually see their notes from only 62 years ago in the library at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Artists shaped the semiotics of this place at that moment. Only a generation after CLR James and others defined the semiotic territory also through writing that they produced for a local journal called The Beacon. West Indian romances, Venezuelan nightmares, calls for unity in the Black world, reviews of books by D.H. Lawrence. The content reminds me of journals promoting intellectual self-determination, such as the Review of the Black World, published by the Nordal sisters from the nearby island of Martinique. But the content is even more diverse, reflecting the wildly intersectional lives of Trinidad as a site of global exchange. So Christopher comes out and contributes to and advocates for that rich intellectual environment as an artist who uses visual, verbal, and social practices to think through, experiment with, enact, and encourage original questions of self-determination and agency. He wrote multiple articles for the Trinidad and Tobago Review in the 90s, for example, and its pages reveal a Trinidad as diverse and focused and thought as does that earlier magazine. I was scrolling through the March 1990 issue, for example. Nelson Mandela has just emerged from prison, raising his fist. Calypso is analyzed as data for those interested in complex discourse around intersecting self-conceptions. The United States is called out for invading Panama. And in the middle of this is Christopher's contribution. He told me not to read that one, but I like it because it is an energetic wrestling of a young man with the title of a peer's recent exhibition, Towards a Caribbean Spirit, and how this trajectory might be characterized when the peer in question has just come back from art school in England. This is actually a really interesting question, given that many of Trinidad's leading artists went to school abroad. It doesn't detract for me from the diversity of thinking on the island, but adds to it. The St. Lucian author Derek Walcott writes that the choice of home or exile is the inevitable problem of all island artists, and notes that the choice to remain abroad is a pardonable desertion. Well, Christopher and others who came home from art school comprise an art world trained at Howard in DC, Goldsmiths in London, Barbados Community College, Edna Manley School in Jamaica, and more. When Trinidad's Creative Arts Center was established at UWI in Trinidad in 1986, it was the first department of creative and festival arts at the university level in town. Too late for Christopher to have gone there, even if he'd wanted to. He went to John Donaldson Technical Institute in Trinidad after high school, but took his BFA in painting at MICA in Baltimore in 1986. He earned his MFA from Rutgers in 1988. Chris productively studied with many people, of course, including Martha Rosler in New Jersey, but I found it especially interesting to hear about his learning formally and informally with Howardina Pindell, Adrian Piper, and Camille Billups, among others, sitting on the train to Stony Brook with one, moving paintings in another's studio, and carrying catalogs through the streets of New York for the whole lot of them, and basically absorbing the perspectives of these important artists, Black diasporic females working on memory, representation, and the rendering of subjectivity from the inside. Christopher's an artist who's used writing to think and to steer and to open up conceptions of the Caribbean, such as his editorial work on Small Acts, a Caribbean Journal of Criticism from 98 to 2010, or his editorial advising to BOM for their Americas issues. I can't help but think that these women in New York might have been a part of a context that not only normalized but valued writing and mentoring practice as legs of their artistic ones. Camille Billups and James Hatch, in fact, published a journal of Black American cultural history called Artist and Influence from 81 to 99, and so they were archiving oral histories all around him at that time. Chris has written about, and his artwork has been about, what it's like to be a subject rendered by someone who comes from outside with an alleged knowledge of real art or control of an economy. What must it have been like to see these women creating in their own creating their own archive and inventory of what it meant to be a Black artist speaking for oneself. So in 2006, Christopher and his collaborators started up Alice Yard, a space and a collective where one is as likely to see young artists drawing on the walls, making mask costumes, rereading CLR James' Black Jacobins, and otherwise weaving criticality and playfulness into the social fabric of arts making. It's a place where he can massage nascent practices into growth spurts. He's been invited to international residencies himself, of course, from the Bag Factory in Johannesburg, South Africa in 99, to universities like Dartmouth in 2007, Cannonball, Miami, 2015, Rauschenberg Foundation, even Northwestern, which is where he made Gasman upstairs. One difference between all of these reputable residencies and the one he created is that Alice Yard can't be characterized only as a residency. It's so much almost an artwork that it, the collective itself as host, showed at Documenta 15 in Casso. As an artwork, its province might be self-representation and all of the diversity that can suggest in a place like Trinidad. Christopher's work can be about the nuances of self-representation at the intersection of global pressures, and it's often figured in shows in which artists contend with the region as such, from early shows like Caribbean Vision, Contemporary Painting and Sculpture in Miami in 95, the 5th and 7th Bienales de La Habana in 94 and 2000, and the second Bienal de Pintura del Caribe in Centro America at the Museo de Arte Moderno in the Dominican Republic in 94, to later ones like Afro-Modern, Journeys Through the Black Atlantic at Tate Liverpool, Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago in LA in 2017, or this one, of course, in which we're currently engaged. It's also, and here's where I'll end, open to larger conversations about the role of objecthood in the definition of self and citizenship, and thus the political legacy of the mundane. It's always a careful election of material history, drawing here, video there, on purpose each time because of what the work is and what it does. when included in the Sharjah Biennial in 2019, the Liverpool Biennial 2021, or the upcoming Prospect 6 in New Orleans, when awarded the Pollock Krasner in 2004, or the Prince Claus in 2013, or the Perez Prize as recently as 23, major funding opportunities that provide him with that greatest luxury of all, time. Christopher works in each of these situations to assemble, as he once said of another artist's work, alternate views of our reality, rearranging and re-seeing. He impacts cultural development, creates, as he put it to me a couple nights ago, zones of empathy, and just generally leads you past your simple questions into the rich rabbit holes that indicate a real commitment to their address. Formal or informal, the markers of his engagement register profoundly, and I look forward now to hearing from him, finally, about how he currently interrogates his practice. So please join me in welcoming Chris Cozier.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for, it looks nice and sunny outside, so I'm astonished that so many people would come here to hear me inside. And I want to thank all involved for bringing me here. I'm really excited to see the show. I've only seen the iteration in Chicago, so I missed the one in Boston, unfortunately. And thank you, Farrah, for that introduction. Now I'm under stress. I have to live up to all those things you have. It felt like I'm now in the center ring, but I don't know if I can match all those expectations, but I will try my best. I'm just going to share a couple images. I'll talk a little bit about, I suppose, the problematics of, yes, leaving an island and coming to the United States, which I did in the 80s, and the problem of returning. The sort of way you fall in a space in between, because of course there's a critique from the place you're from, and then there's the kind of critiques of these kinds of environments. And of course, in the time when I encountered these environments, which was in the mid-80s, it's very different. It's in a much less globalized potential conversation. I think in that era, it's interesting because like one of my works was recently acquired by MoMA, and when I left New York at the end of the 80s, the people that were teaching me were picketing MoMA. That was the era of people, testing, terrorizing these institutions for them to be more in touch with what was going on in the real world kind of thing, and to break down the canon and to expand the conversation. And so it was very funny to find myself back there, all these years later, and how these conversations are shifting. So I'll start. Let me see if I remember how to use this device. I'm going to run through a couple of things because what I really want to bring you to is where my head is now, especially in the context of what's in the show and what orbits that. Because I think the work that Carla reached out to is a work that really defined a kind of juncture in my practice, thematically and also just strategically, like something occurred to me. And the road to that, I think I'd like to share with you all. Did I press the right button? So I wanted to start, I won't spend too much time with this, but this is one of the first works I did when I returned to the island. And it's basically a fragment of a postcard and a snippet of the description of a murder in the newspapers. One column, in a broadsheet newspaper, and a gaudy gold frame. And so it's kind of like a collage, a construction. And what it defines is, the frame is like the field of expectations, how people understand what is art. Something must be art if it's a big gaudy frame. And and, um, and of course, art must be pictorial, and it must talk about the tropical, because we are a tropical place, bright colors, happy people, all that kind of thing. And so that's what I left and what I returned to and what I was trying to make sense of. Of course, in this time in my life, I was very cynical about this. Years later, when the Bahamian writer Krista Thompson started to analyze the construction of the tropical, I began to see this as not something atavistic, but as actually a unique form of Caribbean modernity, because the tropical was the product after sugar. Tourism was coming, the steamship was coming, and the tropical was also a form of a construction. But at this time, the title of the painting is very funny. I titled it after a popular calypso at the time by Black Stalin called Wait, Dorothy, Wait. And Dorothy is an interesting character. If anyone knows about the history of calypso, Dorothy is always there. She went to bathe, she did this, she did that. And calypso is some of the earliest recorded music. I think the first calypso recording was like 1910, 1911 or something like that. In this song, it was during the recession in the 80s. There's lots of parties, and Dorothy wants to party. But every time the calypsonian thinks about partying, he thinks about the price of food, the crisis on the planet. Nelson Mandela is locked up, and so on. So in a sense, my interest in the tropical was framed in that way. The piece is called Wait, Dorothy, Wait, because it has all the attributes of tropical painting that you can buy in the local galleries, but it's saying something completely different. I also, at this point in time, had lost faith in actually making things, because I returned to an environment where what was made, And so this was another work where it was called, it was based on a graffiti that I'd seen in Italy, where it said, "May you all die with extreme comfort." And it was written on many of the fashionable, the fashion posters around Florence when I was a student there in the mid-'80s. And of course, these burglar bars, they're ubiquitous in the Caribbean space, and many others. And we'd taken them for granted, but they really talk about what side of the fence are you on. Are you inside or outside? What is your point of view on the society through these? So I made it as an actual pair of glasses that I would ask people to wear, and I'll photograph them. But sadly, I lost all those photographs because they came from the pre-digital age, and all the slides got mildewed and were lost. But I still have the pair of glasses, thank God. I also started thinking in my particular context, I'm just laying out a series of critical questions. I started thinking in a society with carnival, the performative is something that we often disregard in the construction of a history. In most societies, like that. We didn't have a cabaret Voltaire in the Caribbean or Africa or wherever. In the Caribbean, there were the Camboulet riots in the 19th century, there's the performativity. So how do we construct a history based on our own requirements, our own imagination? So one of my first performances, which was in the early 90s, I wanted to talk about how objects and actions could have equal agency in the social space. So I found this suit. Farrah talked about a journal that I wrote for, the Trinidad and Tobago Review. It was founded by a writer called Lloyd Best, an academic and intellectual. He was part of the New World movement in the late 50s and early 60s. And when he attempted to enter the parliament, he was appointed a senator in the mid-70s. He was refused entry to the parliament because he was wearing a guayabera, right? Because at that point in our history, people went to parliament in a suit still from the colonial era. And it was a sensation. I was a student in high school, and my graduation was coming. So I decided as a kind of, it was like a prank, but I was obviously channeling something. I made a suit just like his and went to my graduation, to test the boundaries. And it stayed in my mother's cupboard at home. And in the early 90s, your mom calls, you better come now, I'm emptying your closet or else. So I ran down there to save what I could. And I saw this suit. And I said, oh my God, I wore that. Oh my God. Because it's made out of suit material, it's navy blue. But it's got all the epaulets and the military pockets, which all the African and the kind of non-aligned politicians of the day wore. So it's kind of interesting, It wants to be Shea on one side and it wants to be Prince Philip on the other. So I decided, okay, I got to do a performance of this. So, and at that time, I was thinking a lot about David Hammonds. I had just discovered Otosika, and of course, boys from my traditional art school training. So I and of course, I also had met, what's his name? Vito Aconci. He had come to visit in a studio program when I was a graduate student. And I was always fascinated by him inviting people to see him do things, right? And so I decided to put out an ad in the newspapers, and I told people I'm going to have a conversation with this shirt jack, but I had no prepared speech. I didn't know what I was going to say. And Caribbean people are supposed to be good at speeches. And so people arrived waiting to hear some kind of big conversation, and I was just there mumbling. And it was a very fascinating experience, my first attempt at a live performance. But I started finding myself talking to the suit and asking certain pointed questions. Like, I decided the suit was Bernard Cord, who was the guy that gave the instructions to kill Maurice Bishop before the American invasion. I talked to Forbes Burnham, asking him why did he kill, assassinate Walter Rodney, and so on and so on. And in the middle of this mumbling, somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder, and I thought, okay, I'm boring. I'm not a theatrical person. And it was a young guy that said, please move aside. I'd like to talk to the suit too. And then I discovered something about that desire to perform. It became kind of therapeutic, which was kind of creepy, but still. But this young guy just sat, it went into zones of absurdity. This young guy sat there and said, because I'm black, you feel I can't listen to rock? And that's when I said, I have to stop this. It's going too far. But a question about the capacity of actions to have the same agency as objects brought up a question about how do we embark upon a history of art or of social dynamics in the society. So that was a real breakthrough for me in terms of my own thinking, because this piece was talked about, for quite some time. So other work started coming out of this, interventions into things. I redesigned the label for a bar of soap, and I wrapped them up. I printed them myself, and then would go in the supermarket and mix them up in the shelves. So many people have this work, but they don't know, or they throw it away, right? And then the people in the supermarket must have been confused, because then where's the barcode? How do you pay for it? So I was thinking about ways of reaching out to public and so on. And these questions stayed with me. So by the mid-90s, towards the end of the 90s, I started also staging gestures where I would ask friends to act out things, and I would film them. And then I would edit those into videos and video installations. So I still didn't know where I was going. I was trying to make sense, because the technology wasn't friendly. In the early phases of video, it takes 2 days to render something, and 10 million computers. And I remember my wife used to laugh at me back in the day. I run out and pay like X $100 or something, and this has 100 megabytes. She's bored. Now, but could you imagine, like now you could get gigabytes, right? So the whole context of video technology then just was driving me crazy, so I abandoned it. And I went back into my studio. I did some, I just, in that video, it was a 4-channel video, so you can imagine how complicated that would have been without the digital technology that we have now. And it was the first work that I got a chance to show outside of the island, having returned. So this project was in the Havana Biennial of 1994. But in that space between, say, 1989, when I returned home, and 1995, when I started venturing back out of the island, I used to spend a lot of time in Caracas. And so that's when I started getting an exposure to sort of Latin American conceptual work. and the difference of that, say, to what I had experienced while I was studying in the United States. What was at stake? What is the agency of that work? And I met a lot of people who were much younger at the time, who were young critics and writers in Caracas. So I was moving back and forth. And so many of these works came out of those kind of interactions, not having the money to ship large works all over the place. Computer technology is coming. So these are wall graphics that I started designing. And then I could just send the image, and then it can be blown up, and things like that. So just kind of experimenting with ways of moving things around outside of certain kind of budgets, institutional budgets. So that's how the installation kind of looked. It was a multi-channel work. But in the midst of doing it, it just became problematic. I was getting frustrated because my fundamental training, going to a school like MICA, was to draw and paint, So I found I was retreating into the studio because I felt I had more autonomy, but I also began to realize that in the beginning, these were drawings for possible, like proposals for possible performances in a kind of Otisika sense. But what I didn't know at the time is that I would get even more committed to the process of drawing. There are many, so I won't waste too much time. There are many of these drawings in many different situations. But the aspect of the performative still sat within the work. And the vocabulary of a kind of post-independence, nationalist space still stayed in the work, Like this piece is a piece that I've actually pulled out of circulation because of how it could be misinterpreted, because it's talking about who is included and who's excluded in the kind of construction of nation, right? And but when I try to pull it out of circulation, friends of mine in Canada, like, queer activists and so on, came to me and said, no, we need to see this work. It's really bringing up some issues, but then there were two camps, because on one side there are people saying, yeah, brother, we understand what you're saying. I said, no, no, no. So we live in an era in which irony is sometimes, we're losing a sense of irony, right? And so it was a work that I just dragged out of circulation. Because these were like gestures that I would do, right? Oh, going the wrong way. So I went, so I did, and then by the end of the 90s, a sense of crisis had come over me. Like, what am I doing? Where am I going? The environment is getting hostile. People don't like the work. They're vexed with me. They're this, that, and the other in a small social environment. I had some offers to go, to do residencies in Europe, in the US, but I was very conflicted, having had the American experience in the 80s, where I still had a little bit of doubt about it as a space for my practice, because, even though I had good relations with professors, but the actual real world was still alienating. And I got an offer to go to England to the gasworks, and I said, but I found out that they had a branch in Johannesburg. It was called it's going from my head right now, the Bag Factory, and Robert Loader, who's the founder of the gasworks, said, well, yeah, I have this. I said, I'm going. So I went to South Africa and did a body of drawing. And that was another turning point in my sort of practice, because the environment, the social environment in Johannesburg really opened a lot of questions to me. Met many interesting artists, had really interesting conversations. And I did a whole series around crutches that was called The Original Injury, playing on the idea of original sin in Catholicism. In other words, like, if you show that you are autonomous and you walk around upright, you're dangerous. If you're hopping, you're acceptable. You can get helped out. So there's a kind of weird way between autonomy and independence, and that kind of social dynamic, which played out a lot in the post-apartheid South Africa. And I saw its connections to my own experience growing up in a place like the Caribbean. Oh, going the wrong way again. So I went deep into drawings. Drawing became very important for me simply because drawing is sort of temporary, it's fluid. A drawing, a mark is like a thought. Some of these drawings, they're so worn, they're like used money, they're tired, they're kind of floppy, because they, and they have a kind of life. Paper has a life. And so to me, it was a counter-narrative, just like performativity, to the kind of training I had in conventional art school, which kind of trains you towards monumentality. Your material choices, your processes for the millennium, as opposed to for the moment. And for that moment, not just of exchange exclusively, but the moment of sharing. And so to me, a drawing is, oh, good, thank you. So a drawing is like a thought, right? No, I thought I was getting a signal at the mic or something. Yeah, okay. It was a time signal, a very important one. And, thank you. And so where am I now? So there are a number of experiments over the years with sound. I'm always in this tension between performativity and making of things. I always like this one. This is like dancehall was rising in the 80s into the 90s. I returned home. I was fascinated by this new phenomena and all the kind of dynamics around masculinity. So this is what I always laugh at, because two dancing girls and a machine gun in the middle. So the machine gun is the metaphor for the dancehall singer, with the erection kind of thing, and the dancing girls, right? So I kind of did an analysis of the whole environment, so that I started reflecting on the sonic space as both a physical space, for speakers, which I was playing around with the early video installation, but didn't realize it. But it's also a a psychological, space as well, So when you're in the dance hall, the song takes you in different directions. You feel it, you hear it, you sense it. And so I started doing these drawings. And they turned into graphic symbols, and I started playing around with song, working with DJs and mixing and so on, right? I'll skip through these series, but I started. One other aspect of my practice that I was not fully aware of is when I was younger, my first studio was actually in my mother's office. My parents were civil servants, so I would go to my parents' office and fiddle around with things on the desk, rubber stamps, paper clips, staplers. I'd be a nuisance, right? And my parents' dream was for me to become a respectable civil servant, And, but I found as my practices evolve, the arsenal of bureaucracy has become something that I use for revelry, investigation, and experimentation. So, so you think of the flags on a desk, But in this piece, I'm using things from history books, right? So in this thing, that's an old engraving in a history book from my childhood. And so the guy on the far right, I would say, winner takes all, right? That's a plantation owner in front of his, territory, his site of production. Then I have an image from a runaway slave thing from the US. I call him Going North. People, and then the guy running off with the briefcase to Switzerland, right? And that I'll call him, well, he was such a good boy, right? Costa Rica and Switzerland, right? And so when you get to the installation, it's like a regatta, right? It's like this one was called cross currents, right? Some people, all the guys with the briefcases are running in one direction, and all the runaways are scattering. And it's talking about the conditions of an island, in a small island. 2% of the deposits in the bank are controlled by, or 50% of the deposits in the bank are normally controlled by 1 or 2% of the population. So no wonder people are going north. And the rest is in Switzerland or Costa Rica or Panama, as it was at one point. So a number of bodies of work came, so I won't spend. In my practice, too, it comes out of conversations. Things sit, and then I try to figure out what they mean. So I'd gone to Denmark to do a project, and I saw that in Denmark they stick flags in sandwiches. I thought that pretty bizarre. And I came home and wrapped sandwiches and kept it on my desk in my studio and put my flag in it. And a friend from India came to visit me in the studio and started singing a jingle from their childhood, which was a jingle for modern bread. There were two brands of bread in India, Britannica and Modern Bread. And when she said modern bread, I was like, oh my God. I started, and so this piece is called The Attack of the Sandwich Men. Because of course, when I was a child in school, coming from a kind of middle-class civil service background, I had packageable food, nice sandwiches, Wonder Bread that was wrapped in greaseproof paper, in a nice Star Trek lunch kit, and the other kids had different kinds of ethnic food. My food was boring, but they thought my food was so progressive because my parents bought it in a supermarket. And I wanted their food because it was more interesting. And there was this tension and all kinds of tension and shame around food, leading to this whole, but it looks like a North Korean military parade or a Canadian housing scheme, And that'll be explained as you see, other parts of my practice unravel. When this piece was shown in Germany, like in 2013, this piece haunted me for a while. I didn't want to wrap sandwiches anymore. It was very scary in Germany. They have a real fear of red, black, and white. And the little radio was a broadcast that I found in the early 60s of an activist explaining people how to sing an anthem properly, right? Not in anyhow, because you're so diverse and weird, you're going to sing it. No, there's one way to sing the anthem. So I'm playing with these ideas of inclusion and exclusion. And many other pieces, but I really just want to run through all of this. This is a fun one, and it kind of tells, sorry. I mean, another part of my practice, I go through newspaper photos a lot, and I found this fascinating photograph of a politician leaving a meeting because of some indiscretion. And of course, the look on his face is smug. That's a no comment expression, right? That the press are asking, why did you do it? And it just reminded me of a B movie that I used to watch as a kid. Philippine James Bond. His name was Tony Falcon. I don't know if anybody is old enough to know those horrible B movies with the Philippine karate guy. So I said, boy, when you have bread and wheels, you're good to go, right? And I started designing. I did a whole installation for the Chicago Institute in Chicago in around 2002, where it's all bread on wheels, even bread with tricked out wheels, right? And so there's little diversions, where I go into these zones. But the idea of the sonic space has stayed with me for a long time, and the obsession with drawing. So I'll take you through more drawing. There's fair, boxes of fair. I think I met the curator of this show in San Juan for the triennial with my boxes of fair, made in the USA but distributed wherever, right? It was around the time of the Iraqi, invasion of Iraq and so on. And, so just boxes of fair. At this juncture, which takes us to where I am now, which is about the mid to late 2000s, a curator came to visit me at home, and we're going through all these projects, but I had a pile of notebooks in boxes and stuffed in corners, and he just snatched up one of my notebooks, and he said, "What's in there?" And I had a panic attack, right? And then he said, "Here's what. Forget all these nice conceptual ideas and video. I just want to show you your notebooks," right? And I was like, "What?" And it was in Arco in Madrid, right? And I was like, "What?" Because it's got phone numbers, grocery lists, as well as drawings and things. Too personal. And then that hit it. But then what it did, I gave him permission. I tried to censor, negotiate, not that one, this one, that one. And it was a show about people who draw, about conceptualization. But it damaged my process because suddenly drawing became performative. The notebooks became performative because they were never intended to be seen. And I had to contend with that. And I was also bored with a certain kind of way in which my work was being read. I don't think glissant had been discovered as yet, but by the kind of curatorial engines out there. But there was a kind of way, if you come from the Caribbean, this is what you must mean, right? So I was always in negotiations with curators about what I was supposed to be thinking about, what I was supposed to be making, because you're from there, right? That's what you're supposed to do. And so I started to draw in a very conscious way with a strong awareness that somebody might see this. And at that time, too, I was traveling a lot. So my studio was leaving my physical place. It could be in a hotel, it could be at a friend. So everything was reduced to a couple bottles of ink and some little pieces of paper. What I didn't know at the time is it would evolve into a wider body of work, right? And the paperclip comes up because it talks about fluidity and a rearranging and rearranging. But the drawings, in an almost Proustian way, as well as a kind of interest in poetics, and there's a writer that's spoken about these drawings in terms of contrapuntal relationships and call and response, because things are repeated over and over, but they come back in new connections, right? And they kind of tell a story about sort of life in the Caribbean at a certain time that I was coming of age. I won't get into details, but, like each drawing has a title, but I kind of play a cat and mouse game with explaining them fully. But if you look at this set, they have titles like See-Through Jersey, See-Through Gun, See-Through Body, Afro-Ophelia, Status Cash Register, and the Venus of Avianca, right? If you decode that, there was a time when there were lots of Colombian women in Trinidad controlled by the police because they were mules, but they were also being trafficked in prostitution. But young people who were fighting against the government were killed by sort of, hit squads, and so that the state can operate in the time that we didn't become part of OPEC, so we suffered on our natural wealth in the 70s. And there was a famous policeman that was the hitman, and he always wore netted T-shirts, and the kinds of guns they were using were the guns that had holes in the barrels. I don't know much about weapons, but so for someone who knows these things, the things start to make sense, but I don't actually normally sit down and explain them literally. And the whole series started after a visit to Spain, seeing drawings by Goya, thinking about Saturn devouring his children. And this was the first drawing in the series. Well, you would have to be a Caribbean person to recognize that. That's the book in which many people who grew up in the Caribbean, it's not used anymore, but it's Cuttridge. It was the book that taught you how to write English. And it had these little pattern on the cover, Grapes of Knowledge, Afro-Ophelia, and so on. Some of the drawings were done this one was done in Haiti, the sense of Saturnalia. This one was done in Jamaica, dancehall. This one I always liked, this is like, because a lot of the drawings talk about being in the water, watching the horizon, bathing in the sea, but also about barriers and walls. How high does a wall have to be to stop you from jumping over it in one single bound, like Letterman, or but you could just see over it to see what's happening on the other side. Cake, I won't get into that. This is one of my favorites, right? This is the field, the pictorial field. So there's a dog and he's peed in the four corners of the paper. And this is the piece that haunts me, right? Because it's a series of almost 300 drawings, and as happens in terms of academics and the art world, this is the only drawing you see in every book, right? And you would swear, this is a big drawing. No, it's like this big, and it's part of 300 drawings. But it seems to make sense to people, and it has been latched onto by academics and writers and so on. And that's one iteration. This is another, So one was the Brooklyn Museum, the other one was the Tate Liverpool, the other one was Santiago de Compostela. So I've been sort of working informally with these kinds of informal sculptures, my obsession with office equipment, sonic spaces. Like I always like this tree. It's the tree outside the Forensic Center in Port of Spain, near to where my mother lives. So, and that's the media when they come, because every time somebody gets killed, the news are waiting to get the angle. But you would not know that tree if you haven't lost a relative. So when the tree appears in my drawings, people just don't understand. You would have to know. Because Trinidad, when I did that first work on returning to Trinidad, with the description of the murder, there were 2 or 3 murders a day in Trinidad. Now there are 2 and 3 murders a year. Now there are 2 and 3 murders a day. You know, the guns coming into the country from the US and Venezuela is almost like a variety of cable stations, you know, and young people are the main victims of this situation. It's a global problem. And I don't know if it's linked to oil economies, God knows what it is, but it's just crazy. And so in a sense, this project was about trying to understand that when I was doing this, when it started. And it just goes without saying, right? That's Belton Road, right? The Chinese build you a nice box to stand on, but it looks like the hangman's box at the same time. The politician, that is. I want to get to sort of where my head is now. So after going through all these experiences, one of the things that struck me as I moved to the end of this presentation was that when people talk about the Caribbean, they seem stuck in the 19th century. They talk about plantations, sugar, the tropical. They talk about ethnography, anthropology, you know, and even within societies, there's a kind of split. But when I sat down and thought about it, what has impacted the Caribbean in the era in which I lived? Because the Caribbean was important, you know, when sugar was important to the Western world. It was an external labor camp of Europe, right, to produce sugar. And that was a globe. And so then in that era, the Caribbean was also very dangerous places. Countries went to war over getting sections of the Caribbean in the America. You know, it's the beginning of the whole global enterprise. And, but nobody talks about what it's like now. In the time that I grew up, it was bauxite from Jamaica, which led to Jamaica's demise, bauxite in Guyana, around the time of NASA and space research and the value, you know, and then oil and OPEC and who's in, who's out. So I started thinking about that, this ubiquitous presence and its impact on the social environment that I grew up in. And so I started playing around with these ideas. I'll skip through the sound stuff. So you get to the Gasman, which is in the show. So I'm in Northwestern, I'm thinking about these things, and I'm walking up and down on Lake Michigan, out in Evanston. And I started thinking about growing up watching Chinese films, right? You know, I used to go to see these karate movies. In Trinidad, we used to call them kick-ups. And they would often make them, they would put an age limit on them. So, you know, if a film was too violent, they would say 18 years and over, or 21 years and over. But of course, I'm 14. How do I get to see Bruce Lee and Carter Wong and Alexander Fouché? Some of these cinemas would let you in the cheapest seats, right? But that was a kind of free zone. You'd be in there with thugs and all kinds of people in the city, but you get to see these films. But you're right under the screen. So if a guy kicks, you almost have to turn, you know? So I was kind of, so I don't know why that came to mind. So I'm at Northwestern. So that's why sometimes there's a distortion, because the distortion is talking about the B movie male masculine spectacle. But it's also talking about the contests on the planet over resources, right? And around that time, I think I saw that film by the Japanese director Sonatine, where these yakuza have a caper, and then they played pranks on each other the night before on a beach, right? And so what happens is I try to work with the theater department, and, you know, I'm doing a residency, and I got frustrated. And one day I just got 2 guys from from the office. They're not actors, they're not theater people, they're just two administrators in the office. I said, guys, if I give you 2 gas pumps, you want to go out on the beach? And they knew exactly what to do. This is a still that I took when I was shooting the video. I mean, these guys, look at how, I mean, it's wild. Just ordinary people activated, you know, like almost going through their own traumas, you know, acting out masculinity and contest. And in a sense, weird way, white maleness as well. It's kind of, boys and guns, right? And pointy things. And so, yeah. And then they started swinging them like lassos. You know, it's like, oh my God. So the piece evolved out of that, about the contest for resources on the surface of the planet, right? In which we still find ourselves trapped. And so there were different iterations of the piece, which then led to this, right? But I'm also a kind of globe. These are different versions of the installation. And of course, there are attendant drawings. I started doing these weird drawings of insects. The kinds of insects that may or may not bite, but they move so fast, and very often they slither under things before, and when you see them, you doubt. But it's also linked to the fact that the drawings are made from text, and the text is libelous, like it appears and disappears. It's kind of, it's in black and white, but it's also obscured. It appears and disappears at the same time. It's like a kind of Dostoevsky type rant, you know, in the notes from underground. And yeah, so I was kind of fiddling with that, how things appear and disappear, you know. And then the next series, I'll just run through. I did a couple of lightbox versions as well for Miami Basel at the Betsy, where they're lightbox drawings. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about. But another project that I like is I started thinking about rising water levels. So I built a sculpture that floats, because a young writer that I was working with from Ethiopia talked about the rising water level will create new social relations beyond the things that stand between us, because we'll all go under. So I kind of interested in the Anthropocene. So and it's funny, I was doing a Rauschenberg residency, and I ordered all this paper, and the paper came in nice boxes and thing. And then I ended up making the work. I'm like a child at Christmas. The work I made in the residency was from the boxes the paper came in. It was like a child at Christmas. You buy them a nice toy, and they play with the box, right? So that's what happened. I can show you the video. So, you know, I created this whole environment where the things, it talks about being afloat. I want to bring you, this is another project that's moving around right now. I call it Home Portal. It talks about the places we leave but could never quite return to. And if you know these kinds of back red steps, they're the ones that are found in a lot of chattel houses coming from slavery, and labor and barrack houses and so on. So I had to do, the first version was in Boston, where what I did was I designed the step in such a way that you could make it yourself. And this is a version that I did in Berlin about 2 years ago with a young Chinese photographer. And he wanted to photograph the steps in a square that's dedicated to an invasion of, so each iteration of this work is a collaboration with another artist. And this was very intriguing, because I didn't know that why there's Tsingtao Bear is because the Germans had invaded a section of China. And then when the Japanese came in, they took over the bear factory and kept it going, that the Germans had made for their soldiers and their, you know, train builders and so on. So Tsingtao Bear exists because of a German invasion of China. So what he wanted is he went to that square in Berlin that commemorates the invasion. But what's interesting, you almost have like a luncheon in the grass going on in the background. This kind of happy Sunday German family picnic is happening on a spot in which they know no connection between the meaning of that location and the things that happen in dark and sweaty places, you know? So I found it a really interesting juxtaposition, the photograph, because the steppe, of course, infers chattel, slavery, and housing. And the piece is ongoing, you know, so I do a number of collaborations. This is a young photographer that I met in Nashville, and I found out he didn't have a passport. I said, "You're a grown man, you don't have a passport?" So I made him get a passport, and I brought him to Trinidad to collaborate with me, you know, just as a kind of experiment. And now a whole version of this project has evolved. Because now there's one in Nashville, there's one in Croatia, there's one in Jamaica, there's like people make it themselves and do the work on their own without me. Or sometimes I invite them to work with me. A lot of the drawings and things. I want to come to this, well, these are the drawings that accompany this project. Another project that I think for me, a kind of constellation of concepts is coming up in my mind, where I realize, as much as I love drawing, I still like to do things out in the public domain. And I think in my work now, what I experiment with a lot is that I kind of stage events, and then I wait to see what will happen. So this project, which I did in the Sharjah Biennial, I'm going the wrong way, is I decided to take the workers from the Sharjah Foundation out in the desert and let them build a scaffolding about as high as they can go that within safety, you know, prospects. And while I was doing it, a bunch of desert kids came. I think they had a camel farm somewhere nearby, and totally messed up the shoot. They photo, you know, they just messed it up. And the guys that I went out with there, who worked for the Royal Families Foundation, kept saying to them, "Guys, we're doing this for the royal family." And the kids were like, "We don't care," right? And I took them out there with workers because I was recording the workers as well, because I realized all these workers were from everywhere else. The people from Sharjah, they hardly do anything except these people are Pashtuns, Bangladeshis, Sudanese, you know, like the whole kind of world connected to that narrative is out there. They're the labor force. And I thought a lot about the Caribbean, you know, so the piece is called Elsewhere's Are Beginnings and Endings, or Endings and Beginnings, because the Caribbean was a place like that. You know, except in these places, the prospect of citizenship is so remote. So I kind of, these are the three culprits. I got them in this photograph. So when I got back home and I analyzed the footage, I realized that's the real story. The tension between who feels grounded and who owns the space and feels they can do what they want in it, and those who are kind of tiptoeing, like me too, because I was invited by the Sharjah Foundation to do a project. And these kids didn't give a shit about that. So I was really fascinated by them. So that became the project, the tension. All while that's going on, I'm still drawing. And in my drawing process, I'm thinking a lot. This drawing is called Turbulence. And it talks about, I was looking at seismic maps when you're drilling for oil. You may have seen some in the earlier things that I skipped through. But I'm also thinking about the moment that a bullet enters, you know, the layers, epidermal layers, and the way the oil, the silicone bit head digs into the ground. And it's a very kind of weird juxtaposition. You know, this violence. But it has a very personal history. My oldest sister, one of them, was the first woman to be allowed onto a rig. Because back in the day, she was a soil specialist. And, you know, during the old-fashioned form of drilling offshore, when they had to tally the seismic, you know, maps with the soil samples. And then, so she had to come on the rig at these pivotal moments. And it was quite a scandal. It was in the newspapers. And this woman, this young geologist, is going on a rig. So when I was growing up, I looked at a lot of the maps, because she would be coming home with the seismic maps. And then, of course, you know, there's all the sensationalism of the murder rate and things that are going on amongst a new generation of young people. And I also thought about the form. The form is suspended. And then I started drawing on the back of the drawings. So these drawings, there was a problematic of how it would function in space. So the only way it could be shown is for it to be suspended because you have to walk around it. So the tension between drawing and sculpture and this sense that a work hovers as it searches for its own kind of critical place to reside. Because during the Liverpool Biennial, when they were planning it, because of COVID, the biennial kept getting postponed. So I was imagining this work, and the room around it started changing. So I had to kind of imagine it independently of any kind of space. The space kept changing. But one of the most interesting things about it, as I kind of close off my presentation, was that I didn't realize that since the very beginning of my practice, I'm thinking about all these themes, but how did this work travel? Well, that's what you can buy in the hardware store. The suspended, that string. The sticks are shish kebab sticks that I cut, and it's just glued on with a glue gun. And so when I had to send my work to the Liverpool Biennial, it was just a shoebox with the drawings and the instructions on how to build that structure. So one of the guys called me and said, "I love your footprint," because he showed me a photograph of boxes coming out of crates, of containers in the background. But for me, it wasn't a strategy with some eco-awareness. It was more an economic strategy because I was living and working outside the art economy at the time. And I didn't realize. And of course, in carnival production, which I grew up in but never paid attention to, things are made out of sticks and paper, in Brazil, in Trinidad. And then when the carnival is over, you burn it. And even in other religious practices, people put things in the water for Shango, or we are one of the rare places in the world where they still practice Ashura. There's a strong Shiite element because something in a lot of Indian indentured workers came into the Caribbean in the 1840s. So they have these large processions, Ashura processions, which is, not common except in Iran and a couple of pockets in Iraq. So, and what did they do with it? They burn it in the sea after building these elaborate things. So there's a kind of way in my practice I didn't realize how this was affecting me, because now I'm faced with the challenge of negotiating with museums who demand monumentality. And my work kind of is floating around in this sort of ethereal, temporary condition. There's a funny thing to close off. How do my obsessions work? I saw this bench on the side of the road, and it blew my mind because one side of the bench is the office chair, and the other side is the worker bench. So I would take all these artists and friends that visit me to sit on the bench, because you get benches like that in a lot of communities, and they're always a discarded chair, and they never get thrown away. They just sit there for people to be. And the pavement is very different from the veranda, and things like that. So over the last couple of years, I've been thinking about a vantage point on the world from the pavement, and the ways in which the commons is kind of being undermined in many parts of the world, where the only spaces that are credible for Black assembly are where you have to pay. When Black people assemble in open space, it's slightly problematic, right? And that has gone on since the lantern laws of the colonial era, where if a Black person had to move around at night, they had to hold up a lantern, moving from one plantation to the next to be legitimate. But it's almost like a passport. So maybe things haven't changed that much. So I'm kind of conceptualizing, and I think I'll kind of stop at that juncture to get Carla into the conversation, and maybe if our organizers feel charitable, even you. Thank you.
I've seen this lecture a few times already, and
And you're still awake.
I'm still awake, and I always learn something new. So it's always a pleasure to hear you speak about your work. And, we've been in conversation for probably over a decade. So it's always funny to do this with the public because I'm always asking him questions. But one thing I wanted to start was, and this is something we've spoken about a lot, and I think the show kind of approaches this in a way, is about this burden of context, or this field of expectations around having to be from somewhere as an artist, or even as a curator, having to be from Puerto Rico. There's a lot of expectations around what kind of work I do, what kind of artists I work with. I'm wondering, how do you negotiate that with institutions, for example, like MoMA, like recently, that acquired your work? And you did talk about Tropical Night, but he didn't mention it. So Tropical Night is the series of almost 300 drawings that he spoke about. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you've encountered this through the years, both in the US, but also within your own context, because even in Trinidad, there's some artists that want to be from somewhere, and that are really thinking very intentionally about approaching the Caribbean in a very particular way, in that 19th century way.
Well, yeah, it's a very tricky thing, because I'm not sure how many spaces there are, like cultural or social or geographical spaces there are on the planet that is so overdetermined, in a sense that, but the problematics of the Caribbean space, it's like the problem is what the space is about, because it's a space of expeditions. In other words, sorry to call his name, but, Columbus came looking for something. He didn't find it. He found something else. But he lied, and he got more money, all right? So that's the beginning of the exchange. That's the beginning of a certain aspect of what constitutes the Caribbean as a site of exchange, right? So I think what a lot of people who live in the Caribbean are constantly in negotiation with is a kind of a gaze that sort of says to you, oh, I want this performance. I want you to do this thing, and I'll give you money, right? Or I'll pay attention to you. And it's like, it's either you dance or you don't dance, right? And I think when I was younger, I've been thinking about this for a long time, but it's actually part of the thing, because it's just everybody's doing it with different levels of awareness and different levels of cynicism. And so it makes it very difficult to figure out what the Caribbean really is, because it's, we don't know what it was like before it became this zone of exchange. We don't quite fully know what the indigenous people were doing, right? We knew that when that encounter took place, there were sort of invasions moving north from the continent and contests between different groups. But that all just ended. And then a new contest began, and you could say, and it all happened during the Enlightenment, it's kind of, towards the Enlightenment. So it's a very interesting challenge, is what I'm thinking. Yes, I'm worried about this demand, and I'm struggling to find my way to some zone of truth. But it's almost like, but it would be untrue to say that there isn't this constant expeditionary enterprise going on.
There is, and also,
every day.
As a site of extraction, knowledge extraction, like people arriving to the Caribbean, looking for you in particular, or maybe in Puerto Rico looking for other actors in the region.
And then sometimes they get upset. I remember, this is a long time ago. Things are changing, but I remember once a curator came to visit me and said, oh my God, I came all this way, and like there's KFC in Port of Spain and contemporary art in your studio, and I was like, and you studied with Leon Golub and Joan Semmel, these are people I know. Yeah. And I said, well, what kind of authenticity do you want me to produce, for you to feel comfortable and for you to get back the money you've spent on your trip? There's a kind of sense that we have to be in this zone. And it's very interesting, and I think it's a theme for some artists. It's very complicated, but I don't know if it's as bad, I don't know, does an artist from Mexico and Japan face the same problem, or Germany? I don't know. It's a very interesting
that we would
question.
have to ask. But I think that some artists that are not part of the mainstream narrative, that kind of have been excluded for some reason, do feel the same way, and I've spoken to them. But one thing that that I keep coming back to is, and people keep asking me the same question is, oh, now we're thinking about the Caribbean once again. What is this moment again, right? So I wanted to ask you that question because there's been kind of, again, a flurry of exhibitions in the last couple of years, including my own. And when I was in the process of making this show, I learned about other exhibitions. There was the Tate Show. There was a show at the Paris Art Museum. And there's still a couple stragglers around, from this kind of new trend. And obviously you're older than me and you've seen this already a couple of times. So I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of what those moments mean to you and what that timeline looks like and how we can create more continuity around looking at these regional, non-regional practices.
Yeah. Well, there has been a shift. I mean, I think at least in terms of my lifetime and experience, which started in the late 80s for me, as more and more Caribbean people, that's a very complicated thing to say, but people, let's say, there's a Caribbean diaspora, and then there's a Caribbean people who actually live in the region. So in the diaspora, there's a kind of stronger idea of memory and things like that, because the Caribbean means something very different. It has a different shape or tangibility. In the physical region, it takes on another shape. And in fact, many Caribbean people don't even know they're Caribbean people until they end up in the diaspora, because when they're in each little respective island, they are the national thing. And then they discover the Caribbean in New York or London or Amsterdam or something like that, right? But separate from that, the early shows were curated by people not necessarily from the Caribbean, not even necessarily from the diaspora. So they came with a kind of list of expectations of what the Caribbean meant to them. Institutionally, whether it meant a kind of place where Europe's encounter with Africa is repeated in this century or that century. But I think now the change I see, and it has an impact on my practice, is that there are more diasporic Caribbean and more Caribbean curators. So I have less explaining to do. They don't, it's like, I can't explain what I mean by that, but it's like, why are you doing this? Or because if you look at some of the writing about, I could give you some classic examples. I was in a show in British Columbia, right? And it's the Cross Currents piece. And the curator is, writing something and he sends it for me. And he refers to what is obviously runaway slaves as migrant workers. So I had to call him. I said, excuse me, a slave is not a migrant worker. A slave is property trafficked from Africa into the Americas. He said, because migrant worker might have labor relations, No, we had indentured labor later when Asians were brought into the Caribbean. But so a Caribbean person would not make that kind of mistake. And then if I've ever been rude, I try not to be rude, but I remember once a French curator came to my studio and he's looking at my work and talking about some show in France. And then he starts talking to himself, like he's kind of musing. And then he says, oh my God, I don't understand why all these people in the Caribbean are so concerned with slavery. So I said, what do you mean? He said, oh, so many people in Europe died during the First World War. We lost millions of people and we've forgotten about that already. And I'm thinking, oh, that's good. Well, congratulations. Bye. Out. Like, don't come. That's the end of the conversation. I mean, like, so we're really across the threshold now where there are younger people studying in institutions in the region, internationally, people like Carla, where I don't have to explain, this is what I'm doing, this is what my practice is about. And, it's a different conversation. And maybe the conversation may actually get more into my practice than snatching a fragment expediently based on a preconceived construction, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going back to Tropical Night. We're so proud, all of us, your friends and colleagues, that it has been acquired by MoMA. I haven't seen the installation yet, but it truly is a masterpiece of contemporary art in the Caribbean. So
She said that.
we're all very excited, but I'm wondering, and we haven't talked about this, just the two of us, but what was it like for you to, see your work up at MoMA, especially next to Jacob Lawrence? I know you're still processing it, but I feel like Tropical Night is such an important part. Like you were talking about different notes in your artistic practice, which Gassman is an important part, but Tropical Night is extremely important because you're going inward into a very intimate moment in a kind of solitary practice of drawing, working in a very portable way, with the notebook, working constantly in airplanes in different places. But you give it this title of the tropical night still, addressing the tropical in your own way. So first, talk a little bit about that work in particular and what it means to you, and then seeing it at MoMA next to Jacob Lawrence within that context of the Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the title, to use tropical in the title was kind of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, of course, after night, there's day. But there's a strange argument between the two significant kind of older thinkers, Naipaul and Walcott. Two Nobel Prize for literature, blah, blah, One was a novelist, one was a poet. They kind of hated each other. And so I grew up in that space. One was a kind of an apologist for the Caribbean. The other one was just very critical, out of an irascibility, but also out of an impatience, right? And they all had their reasons, but they're both straight. And one of the funny things about that in that argument, in one of Naipaul's essays, early essays, one for which he's not forgiven, it's in one of his early, it's called The Middle Passage. It's an early series of essays where he writes about each island. And he says very horrible things. And in fact, when he became older, he said he very regretted writing that, as mean as he's known to be, right? And in the Trinidad thing, there's a little paragraph where he talks about an art show. And a painting in the art show is called Tropical Fruit, right? So he says, well, why would Cézanne call his still life Mediterranean or, something fruit? So he was talking about who is this art for and how is it pitched and what's the purpose of this gesture. So he kind of hints at a kind of crisis of expectations or a field of expectations. And so in a way, I was reading that at the time. So that's one issue. To be honest, I didn't really, the MoMA thing came as a big surprise. So it's a really difficult question to answer. Because when I left New York in the end of the 80s, places like MoMA seem remote, getting into collections like that. Americans can't get in, dark and other kinds of Americans weren't getting in. And so what are my expectations as a person not even from the US, from out? And it's kind of ironic because Keniston McShine, who was a Trinidadian, was one of the chief curators at MoMA at the time. And coming from a family of people that I kind of was aware of in the context of Trinidad. So I was quite surprised when the call came. You know, they're looking at this work and they're discussing it. It was in two shows, two significant shows, Infinite Island and the Afro-Modern at the Tate in Liverpool. And I mean, I would say that the Infinite Island is a show that was very heavily criticized in the New York art world. But I give the curator credit to Mela Mosaka, because I know when he was first embarked upon it, he had no interest in coming into the Caribbean at all. He was really coming out of the greater New York kind of question. And a friend of mine, a colleague, had said to him, no, you really need to go down in the islands and look around. And in a way, he kind of breached a zone of acceptability by bringing artists living in the Caribbean into the same conversation as artists living in New York and functioning in the international world. So you have somebody like Alora and Casadelia next to me, or somebody like Raquel Pawinski next to, you know? So I think for certain people in the kind of establishment of the art world, that was like sort of slightly presumptuous, right? But I think it changed the way people understood work coming from the Caribbean, as opposed to work functioning in the diaspora, in England, Canada, and the US. So yeah, when it happened, I was very confused. And well, it's still new. It's up now. About a week ago, I was in New York to install it. It's there, people are seeing it. I don't know, I kind of feel dumbfounded, you know, because maybe I'm pinching myself to see if it's real. And it feels weird, you know, because of course you need an American visa to see it now, and you need $30 to get in MoMA. So a lot of Caribbean people will not see this work. And the work was done in the Caribbean and around. But there's something else that's also interesting about the work, which is something I've been thinking about, the war label and I call it the geography of production, because so much about Caribbean life is about people working off plantation, off site. It's a mobile population. So the work, in a sense, and a lot of my work, I've come to terms with the fact that it's imagined between locations. It's imagined on the move. Mm-hmm. While there's a demand institutionally for the work to be from somewhere, right? That's known, that's understood, you know? So when you see a label and you see Chris Cozier, Trinidad and Tobago, but the work was made where? I don't know, right? And many artists are kind of being faced with that question. The question of the geography of production, and then sometimes the question of collaboration and interaction. These are questions that are interfering with the institutional structures or understandings, yeah.
I have one final question. I've already asked this question in another lecture, but I want to ask it again because he did not answer it. So I hope you had time to think about it this time. I'm going to try again, because what Chris is a very, very humble artist, and that's why, you know, I care about him so much as a friend as well. But apart from being a collaborator in Alice Yard and having his own incredible artistic practice, he's also an incredible mentor to generations of artists and curators. A lot of artists are in the show Forecast Forum. And in the last lecture that I saw of yours, you were talking about how his work has had to adapt to the issue of portability or the shipping issue. Mm-hmm. For example, there's a lot of works that are by instructions, or like the vinyl that you spoke about, that you can just print it everywhere and put it up. So, or the notebook, the portability of the notebook, that is part of Tropical Night. So it has had to adapt to these issues around circulation, so it could circulate in a very cheap, right? As a working artist with limited budget in Trinidad. So there's a way in which his work circulates in a particular way, but his work also circulates discursively through curators like myself that have been in conversation with him over a decade, artists like Ebony Patterson, Cosmo White, Deborah Jack. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And I'm so indebted to you for these years of conversation that have shaped my curatorial practice and this exhibition as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk about your role as a mentor to all of us, and that you're always there to lend an ear when we have these critical questions that we're asking ourselves, not only about our own work, my own work as a curator, but all the challenges that I face with the type of work that I do in an institution in the United States. And you're always there to help us work through these issues or to look at these complexities. And you also bring us together. You bring us together. So you're this a very important, like, conceptual, discursive node between younger generations of creative practitioners. And I'm wondering, how do you see that role discursively as an interlocutor to so many of us? And how do you see your ideas circulate not only through exhibitions like Forecast Forum, because your ideas around the Caribbean as a site of exchange is definitely in the show, as you will see if you haven't seen the show, but also in the works of artists that have been shaped by your mentorship, your ideas, and your feedback.
It's a lot. Well, you kind of explained it more this time. But last time it was my mind, but my mind was in a completely different location at the time. Actually, I don't get a chance to think about it in that way, but I do think in any artist's practice, particularly, there is this kind of world making. You work, and I think in the Caribbean it's extreme because you're struggling with trying to understand the value of context and readability, And when I was doing research into, say, previous generations of Caribbean artists, I would find these essays published in some, journal in the 50s or early 60s or back in the 40s. And the first 2/3 of the article, they would start talking about the history of Trinidad, who came, who settled, the geography. And I'm a young researcher, right? So I'm waiting for them to start talking about the art. And then they'll just mention some quick thing in the last paragraph. And I felt very negative, very conflicted about that. And then I began to realize what's really going on here is that they're in this kind of context where they feel they have to explain, like it's a burden that they have. An artist working in these kinds of contexts, there's already a kind of a canonical enterprise. There's already institutional conversations. So there's a feeling that you're going to sit, your work is residing in some sort of contextual machinery, right? Successfully or unsuccessfully, in or out, it exists. But I think in the region itself, that's something that's hard to kind of define. So I began to realize that if I was going to have a practice, a significant component of or condition of that would be to sort of remain open and be in conversation with other artists and to try to be as an encouraging because I want somebody to hear me, so I have to share. And I didn't make it up on my own. When I was in graduate school, one of the artists that was, very friendly to me and helped me quite a lot, even when I returned to the Caribbean, was Leon Golub. And what always struck me about him is you could call him anytime, even when I came back to the Caribbean. And you could go and sit down in his studio. He had a studio in LaGuardia Place, and he was very organized, but he would say Thursday evening, Friday afternoon at a certain time. And I'm thinking, here's this guy, he's got a big career, but you could just go and see him. And he would give you a fair amount of time. And he asked me many provocative questions. And one of the questions he never answered, and I've not been able to answer, but he kind of said to me, if you're in your studio and you're deep in concentration and you hear glass breaking on the street outside, do you stop painting and go and look out the window, or do you continue painting and ignore it, right? And he said to me, which artist will last, right? And I've never been able to kind of understand that question fully. But I think what he was trying to say is that you've got to be aware of what's going on around you at all times, and you have to be in conversation with it. And which he certainly was. He mentored a lot of young artists, people in the street. So, I mean, of course, when he was doing that, he was at the top of his game, very established. When I returned to the Caribbean, you know, I went through some desperate moments, but I always found solace in the company of younger artists or other artists, because we found empathy. You know, we found solutions to problems, you know, that we couldn't quite work out. And that's what actually led to Alice Yard, the space that I run with some colleagues, because it means that if you're in the middle of a crisis, you could pick up the phone, or you have somewhere to go, a place to feel that you belong, or a place to feel somebody will listen. Because, you know, at the end of the day, that's, apart from money, you know, I think that's what all artists want. And I think in a place like the Caribbean, there's this notion that the Caribbean is becoming shrewd, becoming more hostile. No, the Caribbean began as a shrewd, hostile place, the Caribbean that we found ourselves in, right? And the enterprise of, you could say, the Caribbean is to make what was once an external labor camp of Europe into a civil society. It's not the, you know, it's not the opposite way around, where people are trying to make us less playful and more. The very act of play, the very act of calling oneself an artist, we weren't brought here to imagine and to dream. We were brought here to work, to create wealth for people elsewhere, you know? And so the struggle to make it into a human place, less competitive, less aggressive, is what it's really about. And even if you go back and you study some of the early dynamics of the Haitian Revolution, there's some really interesting letters that people wrote asking questions. Because, you know, when Toussaint first took over the place, he kind of convinced some of the slaves to stay on the plantations. And that was a very problematic thing, you know, because he wanted to have a productive state. And he wanted to remain in a relationship with France, you know, because it was, you know, it was Haiti that built Versailles and the wealth of France, you know. So he felt he had to keep the engine going. And that was a very conflicted position. And I think in the context of Cuba, the same thing comes up. You know, there's a weird set of Caribbean thinkers that said, oh, you know, if Cuba had actually just focused on liberating Cubans, especially black ones working out in the rural areas, it would have undermined the industrial origins of the place. But they got caught up in Cold War idealism, right? Which then brought them into the, you know, sites of the Cold War. And then that, I don't know if that's true, but I've been coming across texts and essays written like in the 60s by kind of economists, you know, Caribbean economists of a certain generation. So I think the struggle in the Caribbean is, how do we become, well, I don't want to say human, because, you know, I mean, human was invented in the Enlightenment. So we have to become something else, right? Because the Enlightenment happened at the same time as the slave trade, right? So at the building of the colonial enterprise. So, and writers like Sylvia Winters and so on tried to say, what else can we imagine? What else can we become to deal with the conditions that we find ourselves in now? So I find in my own practice, the demand of my training was to become sole masculine producer. And, you know, in a very conventional art history sense. And it's just boring, it's not interesting, and it's not relevant to the times in which we find ourselves. But I had to kind of process my way through that, you know, and if that answers the question. I really kind of still can't grasp the extent of the influence you claim I have, but I do really, I'm always astonished by the confidence that a lot of these younger artists, sometimes even more successful than my own self, have placed in me.
Well, we talk about it all the time amongst ourselves. But I want to thank you, Chris, for this long-term friendship. And this has been a lovely evening. And thank you all. I believe the galleries are open until 8 o'clock. So please pass by and see the show if you haven't seen it yet. Thank you.